I let my broke dad and his wife stay in my house. A month later, she sat me down and demanded I pay them rent. Life has never been easy for me. From the very moment I was born, it felt like I was carrying a weight too heavy for my tiny shoulders. My mother passed away during childbirth, and instead of being welcomed into the world with love, I was met with blame. My father, the only parent I had, held me responsible for her death, an accusation I was far too young to understand but one that shaped my entire childhood. Growing up, not a single day went by without my dad reminding me, in his own cruel way, that I was the reason she was gone. He would say it outright or let it slip into conversations, always making sure I knew that my birth had cost him the woman he loved most. He made no secret of the fact that he never wanted me. And because my life had come at such a high price, he believed I owed it to him, to her, to make something of myself. If I didn't, then her death, in his eyes, would have been meaningless. As a child, hearing that from the only parent I had was devastating. I was too young to grasp grief or loss, too small to make sense of the anger he carried. All I knew was that I needed my mother too, but she wasn't there. And the one person who was supposed to care for me instead saw me as a burden, a living reminder of everything he had lost. My father, the man who should have been my protector and my guide, was the very person who made me feel like I didn't belong. Living in that house felt like walking through a storm with no shelter. I carried a constant sense of guilt, as if my very existence was something to apologize for. There were so many times I wanted to tell him how much his words hurt, how they made me feel like a stranger in my own home. But fear kept me quiet. And the rare times I did try to speak up, I was met with even more bitterness, more anger, more reminders that I was unwanted. So, I learned to stay silent. While other kids had parents who lifted them up, who cheered them on, who made them feel safe, I tiptoed around my own father, trying not to make things worse. It wasn't just the lack of love that hurt, it was the constant presence of blame, the unshakable feeling that no matter what I did, I would never be enough. And yet, despite everything, I still wanted his approval. I still hoped, foolishly, desperately, that one day, he'd look at me with something other than resentment. Every time I brought home a good report card, I held onto the hope that maybe this time, he'd be proud. I'd hand him my grades, waiting for a nod, a smile, even the smallest sign that I mattered to him. But it was always the same. He'd glance at the paper, barely acknowledging it, before telling me to study harder because it still wasn't good enough. There were plenty of other kids who got good grades, he'd say, so why should he care about mine? It wasn't just school where I felt his disapproval. Anything outside of my studies, whether it was playing sports, making friends, or simply having fun, was dismissed as a waste of time. Anytime I asked to join an activity or spend time with friends, he shut me down without a second thought. He made it clear that my only purpose was to study hard and get out of his house as soon as possible. He spoke about it like it was a favor to me, like he was giving me a chance to escape. But all I heard was that he couldn't wait for the day I was finally gone. My friends would talk about how their parents encouraged them to follow their passions, to enjoy their childhood. But I never knew what that felt like. In my father's eyes, I wasn't his son, I was an obligation, a mistake he wished he could undo. Even weekends, which should have been a break from school, were no different. If I ever asked to go to the park or visit a friend's house, he'd explode, ranting about how much money he spent keeping a roof over my head and how I had no right to waste time on something as meaningless as friendships. Anything that made me happy, that made me feel even a little normal, was something he viewed as unnecessary, undeserved. But the worst moment, the one that really solidified what I had known all along, was my 15th birthday. Most kids look forward to their birthdays, excited to celebrate with their friends, to feel special, even if just for a day. But for me, my birthday was always something I dreaded. My father never liked me celebrating it, but that year, I thought maybe things would be different. All I wanted was something simple, a movie with my friends and a slice of pizza. That was it. I hesitated before asking him for some money, bracing myself for his reaction. And when it came, it was worse than I expected. He didn't just say no, he erupted. He screamed at me, furious that I even had the audacity to think about celebrating the day my mother died. He made it clear that, for him, my birthday would always be the worst day of the year. That it wasn't a day to be happy, it was a day to mourn. So, I didn't celebrate. I never did. By then, I had stopped expecting anything different. Over time, the weight of his rejection, his indifference, his anger, settled into me. I learned that no matter what I did, it would never be enough. I was never going to be enough. So, I stopped trying to earn his approval. I stopped hoping for his love. Instead, I focused on one thing, getting out. I poured everything I had into my studies, knowing that education was my only way out of that house. If I couldn't have a father who loved me, at the very least, I could build a future where I wouldn't need him. And in the end, that determination paid off. The day I received my acceptance letter to a top university along with a full scholarship was the day I finally felt free. A wave of relief washed over me. After years of walking on eggshells, of feeling like I didn't belong, I was finally leaving. I was stepping into a new life, one where I could finally exist without feeling like I had to apologize for it. For the first time, my future was mine. Leaving home felt like shedding a heavy weight I had carried for far too long. For the first time in my life, I was free, truly free. There were no more watchful eyes, no more guilt or blame pressing down on me. I could finally breathe. College became the fresh start I had always dreamed of. Those 4 years turned out to be some of the best of my life. It was a time of growth, discovery, and joy. I finally got to experience what it meant to live like a normal young adult, doing all the things that had always been out of reach. My dad no longer had control over me, though he still tried to assert his influence from afar. But I didn't listen to him anymore. I had spent enough years living under his shadow, and now, it was my time. My life. My choices. Despite my newfound freedom, I never lost sight of my goals. I worked hard to maintain my grades, determined to make the most of the opportunity one had fought so hard to earn. But I also made sure to enjoy myself. I went to parties, joined clubs, made friends, pursued my hobbies, and, for the first time, I felt like I was truly living. It was during this time that I met Sheila. Meeting her was unexpected, but it quickly became one of the best things that ever happened to me. From the moment we crossed paths, there was something about her that pulled me in. We were alike in so many ways, both ambitious, driven, and deeply focused on building our futures. But what really made our relationship special wasn't just our shared goals, it was the way we understood each other. With Sheila, I didn't have to explain myself. She just got me. She understood my silences, my hesitations, the weight I had carried for so long. One of the things I loved most about her was that we could sit together for hours, not needing to fill the space with words. She never pressured me to talk, never demanded more than I could give. She allowed me to just exist, without expectation, without judgment. For the first time, I didn't feel like I had to carry the guilt of my past alone. Sheila saw through the pain I had been living with, the pain that had become so much a part of me that I barely recognized it as something abnormal. She pointed out what I had never allowed myself to fully accept, that my father was wrong. That no child should ever have to bear the weight of blame for something beyond their control. She was the one who encouraged me to seek therapy. At first, the idea seemed foreign to me. I had spent so many years believing my dad's words, letting them shape my reality, that I didn't even consider that there might be a way to escape them. But Sheila made me realize that I didn't have to keep living under the weight of his grief and anger. Therapy turned out to be one of the most transformative experiences of my life. It wasn't easy. Confronting my past, unraveling the damage, and challenging the beliefs I had carried for so long took real work. But it was necessary. For the first time, I began to see things clearly. I realized how deeply flawed my dad's thinking was, how unfairly he had placed the burden of his loss on me. Slowly, I started to unlearn the guilt that had been drilled into me since childhood. I wasn't responsible for my mother's death. And my father's anger? That was his to deal with, not mine. As I healed, something else started to surface: anger. Real, deep, long-buried anger. For so many years, I had tried to be the child my father wanted, hoping to earn his love, his approval. I had carried his grief as if it were my own. But now, I saw it for what it was: a burden that was never mine to bear. That realization made it nearly impossible to maintain any kind of relationship with him. During college, we spoke less and less. And when we did, our conversations were strained, filled with tension. I had little patience for his attempts to control me, and I no longer hid my bitterness when I spoke to him. Then, one day, it all came out. I hadn't planned to confront him. I hadn't rehearsed any speeches. But after years of holding it all in, it finally spilled over in a moment of frustration. I told him everything: how he had blamed me for something I had no control over, how his words had shaped my entire life, how deeply his actions had hurt me. And I made one thing clear: I was done being his scapegoat. If he wanted a place in my life, he had to treat me with respect. Otherwise, I would cut him off completely. For once, he didn't have a response. He didn't apologize, not that I had expected him to, but he also didn't deny what I was saying. After that conversation, something shifted. He wasn't warm or affectionate, he never would be, but there was a noticeable difference in the way he spoke to me. His words were gentler, his tone less harsh. It was as if, for the first time, he was making an effort. But effort wasn't enough to erase the years of damage. I appreciated the small change, but I knew that some wounds ran too deep to be undone with a few softer words. Our relationship remained distant, and even now, we are far from close. But despite that, I no longer carry the same anger I once did. I've come to accept that while I can't change the past, I do have control over how I let it shape my future. Sheila has been a huge part of that healing process. Her support, her belief in me, her love, it all helped me see that I am more than my father's resentment. I am worthy of happiness. Recently, my dad got married to his girlfriend, Day. It was a small, intimate wedding. Despite everything, I decided to attend, bringing Sheila along with me. We wanted to show our support, to wish them well as they started this new chapter of their lives. A part of me hoped that maybe this would be a turning point for my father, that having a wife again would soften him, make him better. For a little while, it seemed like things were changing. But then, just a month after the wedding, I got a call from him. His voice was tense, almost desperate. He had made some bad financial decisions, and now, he was in trouble. He hadn't been able to pay rent for the past 6 months and was facing eviction. The worst part? He hadn't even told his wife. He was too afraid that it would start a fight between them. And just like that, after years of pushing me away, he was suddenly reaching out asking for help. The first thing my dad asked me was if I could cover his rent. I didn't even hesitate before saying no. Even though I had the money to help him, I refused. I had worked too hard to build the life I had, and I wasn't about to become his financial safety net. Given our history, I knew exactly how this would play out. If I helped him once, it would never be the last time. I didn't want to set that precedent. But later that night, after talking it over with Sheila, doubt started creeping in. I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe I was being too harsh. After all, despite everything, he was still my dad. What if, for once, he genuinely needed help? So, after thinking it through, I called him back and offered a compromise. I told him that while I wasn't willing to pay his rent, I was willing to let him and Day stay at my house temporarily. Since I lived alone and had plenty of space, they could stay until they managed to save enough to get back on their feet. It wasn't an easy decision, given everything that had happened between us, but I felt it was the right thing to do. I made sure to set clear boundaries. I let my dad know that this arrangement was temporary, and I expected him to work toward fixing his situation. He didn't answer right away, but after a couple of days, he called me back and agreed. Within 2 weeks, he and Day moved in, and I set up a guest room for them. At first, we all struggled to adjust. It had been years since I last lived with my dad, and we were both completely different people now. I wasn't that quiet, fearful teenager anymore. I was an independent adult with my own life, habits, and routines. But despite the passage of time, it didn't take long for some things to stay the same. My dad started slipping back into his old ways. He made comments about my lifestyle, the way I kept my house, the way I spent my time, like he was still the authority figure and I was still a kid under his roof. But this time, I wasn't willing to tolerate it. Every time he tried to criticize me or dictate how I should live, I shut it down immediately. I wasn't aggressive, but I was firm. I made it clear that he had no right to tell me how to live, especially while he was staying in my home, rent-free. I wasn't the same person he had once controlled, and I refused to let him have that power over me again. Of course, Day didn't take too kindly to this. Every now and then, she would make comments about how I needed to show my father more respect, how he had sacrificed so much for me. I'd just shake my head and bite my tongue. She clearly had no idea about half of the things he had put me through as a child. I did respect my dad, but respect didn't mean letting him walk all over me. I wasn't going to go back to that place where I prioritized his comfort over my own well-being. I had spent too much of my life trying to please him at my own expense, and I wasn't about to slip into that pattern again. Still, I knew it wasn't my place to expose him today. If she wanted to believe in the version of him he had shown her, that was her choice. So, whenever she made those remarks, I let them slide. It wasn't worth the argument. I had hoped that, despite our differences, we could find a way to coexist. That maybe, with time, we could live under the same roof without too much friction. But then, one evening, everything boiled over. I had come home after an exhausting day at work, only to find my dad sitting on the couch, watching TV with Day. The house was a mess. Dishes were piled up in the sink. It was his turn to clean. Trying to keep my frustration in check, I asked, "Dad, why haven't you cleaned up? We agreed that you and Day would help with the housework, and it was your day to do the dishes." He barely looked at me before scoffing. "You know," he said, slipping into that condescending tone that had always made my skin crawl, "I raised you on my own after your mother died. You should be ashamed of yourself for expecting me to do more work for you at my age. You're a grown-ass man. Wash your own damn dishes." Something inside me snapped. I wasn't a kid anymore. I wasn't going to just take it. I shot back, "You know what's actually embarrassing? The fact that you're sitting here, in my house, on my couch, watching my TV, eating my food after you begged me to move in for free, and now you think you get to order me around? If you don't feel like washing the dishes, you can pack your bags and leave. Any time. My dad just stared at me, completely caught off guard. A thick silence filled the room, and for a brief moment, I thought he might actually get up and walk out. But we both knew he had nowhere else to go. So, without waiting for a response, I turned and walked off, slamming the kitchen door behind me, my heart pounding with a mix of anger and exhaustion. The next morning, I went downstairs to grab some coffee, expecting more tension, maybe even an argument. Instead, I found myself alone in the kitchen with Day. My dad had already left for work. As I was about to leave, she cleared her throat. "Can we talk?" she asked. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I nodded and took a seat. With a serious expression, she told me how hurt my dad was after our fight. She said I had no right to treat him that way, especially considering all the money he had supposedly spent to help me buy my house. I blinked. I had to stop myself from laughing on the spot. My dad hadn't given me a single cent since I left for college. I had bought this house entirely with my own money, saving for years to make it happen. Trying to stay calm, I asked her to explain. She went on to say that my dad had told her he used his savings to help me buy the house. That he had made financial sacrifices for me, and now that he was struggling, it was only fair for me to repay him by paying rent to them while they stayed with me, since, according to her, this was basically my dad's house too. And that's when I lost it. I laughed. I mean, really laughed. The kind of deep, uncontrollable laughter that comes when something is so ridiculous you can't even take it seriously. Day looked taken aback, but I couldn't help it. The sheer absurdity of the lie my dad had told her was just too much. When I finally managed to compose myself, I leveled my gaze at her and said, "Day, let me make one thing clear, this house. It's mine. My dad didn't contribute a single dime to it. I bought it with my own money. Whatever he told you is a complete lie." She didn't respond right away. I could see the wheels turning in her head, the realization creeping in that maybe, just maybe, she didn't know my dad as well as she thought she did. The look on Day's face was priceless. It was clear she had no idea I owned the house, and the embarrassment and probably anger she felt must have been overwhelming. She stared at me for a moment before finally asking if it was really true, if my dad had never helped me out. I didn't hold back. I told her the plain truth, my dad hadn't given me a single cent toward this house. In fact, he couldn't even afford his own rent, so how on earth would he have been able to contribute to mine? I think reality must have sunk in for her at that moment because she didn't argue. She didn't try to defend him. She just went quiet. Not long after, she packed up her things and left. She didn't say much, and I didn't stop her. It wasn't my business to interfere. Whatever she chose to do next was entirely up to her. Later that evening, when my dad came home, he immediately called Day, confused as to why her belongings were gone. It didn't take long for him to figure out what had happened. The second he realized I had told her the truth about the house, he turned his anger on me. He accused me of ruining his marriage, of making Day uncomfortable, of deliberately sabotaging his relationship. According to him, I should have just kept my mouth shut. I should have let her believe his lie. He told me that now, thanks to me, he felt small compared to me, as if it was somehow my fault that he couldn't afford a place of his own. It was beyond frustrating. Here I was, offering him a home, giving him a place to stay when he had nowhere else to go. And instead of gratitude, all I got was blame. He seemed to forget that I didn't know him anything. And yet, here he was, once again, making me the villain in his story. Just like when I was a child, he wanted to pin his failures on me. But this time, I wasn't going to let him. I told him exactly what I thought. I reminded him that I had gone out of my way to help him, that I had offered him a place to stay when I didn't have to. And yet, instead of appreciation, he was trying to twist everything into my fault. But he didn't care about my side of things. Instead, he demanded that I fix things. He wanted me to call Day, apologize, and clear things up by lying and telling her that he had financially contributed to my house. That was my breaking point. I was exhausted. Exhausted from the manipulation. Exhausted from the blame. Exhausted from carrying the weight of his problems for so many years. So, I told him the truth, plain and simple. I couldn't do this anymore. I told him that his presence in my home was taking a toll on my mental health and that I needed to protect my own peace. I asked him to pack up his things and move out the next day. The decision wasn't easy, but it was necessary. He protested, of course. Said he had nowhere else to go. Begged for more time. But I didn't care anymore. For once, I put myself first. And so, the next morning, my dad moved out. Update 1. Ever since he left, my dad has been calling me, complaining that I ruined his life and his marriage. Day refuses to speak to him, and according to him, that's all my fault too. He insists that a good son would never kick his own father out. but I don't feel guilty. Not anymore. A lot of people have suggested that I reach out today and tell her the full truth about my childhood. Until now, I had avoided getting involved in his personal life, but I realized something she deserved to know. If he had lied to her about this, who's to say he hadn't lied about other things too? I decided it was time to have a conversation with her. Update 2. A week later, I finally sat down with Day and told her everything. She was shocked. She had no idea about the kind of childhood I had. My dad had painted himself as a struggling, devoted single father who had sacrificed everything for his child. I couldn't help but shake my head in disbelief. I shared with her the years of blame, the emotional trauma, and the way my dad had made me feel like I was responsible for my mother's death. She listened, her expression shifting from disbelief to sympathy to anger. Then, she told me something I hadn't known. My dad had actually lost all his money due to gambling. That's why he was struggling so badly, but he had been too ashamed to tell me. Instead, he had lied today, told her he had financially contributed to my house, just to make her feel more comfortable about moving in. The moment she found out that it was all a lie, she had been devastated. And now, after hearing the full truth about my childhood, she told me she needed time to reflect on her relationship with my dad. Before we parted ways, she apologized for the way she had acted and for the assumptions she had made. I reassured her that none of this was her fault, the blame was entirely on him. Update 3. It's been 3 months since I last spoke to my dad. I have completely cut him out of my life. It wasn't an easy choice, but it was necessary. I spent years carrying the weight of his pain, trying to earn his love, trying to make things work. But I realized something, I don't have to do that anymore. The last time we spoke, he tried to blame me for everything again. But this time, I didn't engage. I simply blocked him. And for the first time in my life, I feel free. The stress, the manipulation, the constant emotional toll, it's all gone. And in its place, I feel relief, clarity, peace. Sheila has been incredibly supportive through all of this. She's been my rock, offering me love and encouragement as I navigate this new chapter of my life. Her presence reminds me that I am not defined by my past. With my dad out of the picture and Sheila by my side, I'm finally focusing on the future I want. I'm chasing my goals, building the life I deserve, and embracing the happiness that, for so long, felt out of reach. And for once, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be.